In the grand lobby of the exclusive Arlington Club, a successful black businessman approaches to check in for his meeting, but the receptionist cuts him off, directing him to the staff entrance in the back. Even with a confirmed reservation, he's treated with suspicion and security is called. What they don't know is he's the CEO, and what happens next will shake the entire nation. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thoughts. The Arlington Club in New York didn't speak, it whispered. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen rain above a lobby paved in white marble, where every sound was muffled by money. The air was scented with imported flowers, old brandy, and something sharper: hierarchy. People moved with entitlement, the way you only do when you've never had to explain who you are. And then the front door opened. Daniel Carter stepped in, a black man in his early 40s. His navy suit fit like it had been sculpted for him, sharp and understated. A silver timepiece caught the light at his wrist. His expression was calm, unreadable. But his eyes were alert, always alert, the eyes of someone who had walked through too many rooms where he wasn't expected, but never asked twice. He crossed the lobby toward the reception desk. Behind it stood Melissa Grant, mid-30s, crisp blouse, name tag gleaming. Her smile faded the moment she looked up. She didn't wait for Daniel to speak. "The service entrance is in the back," she said curtly, gesturing behind him. Daniel stopped, unbothered on the surface. "I have a reservation," he replied, evenly. "Carter, meeting room 4. Melissa hesitated. The name meant nothing to her. Still, she turned to the computer, typing slowly, eyes flicking up at him between strokes. She found the name. He was listed. But her posture stayed rigid, her expression unsoftened. "I'll need to see your membership card," she said flatly, the edge of suspicion buried beneath polished courtesy. Daniel nodded once and reached into his inner jacket pocket. Melissa's hand slipped under the counter. Click. Silent alarm. Daniel didn't react. He'd seen this dance too many times. Still, it stung, the assumption, the reflex. He withdrew his wallet slowly, deliberately, offering no sudden movements. "Just my card," he said calmly, aware that any trace of irritation in his voice could be turned against him. Melissa took the ID without looking directly at him, her fingers slightly trembling, though she tried to hide it. Down the hall, the muffled sound of leather shoes quickened. Security had been notified. Daniel didn't flinch. But the room had changed. A woman near the fireplace lowered her newspaper. A suited man whispered to his companion, nodding toward Daniel with a raised brow. To them, his presence was a disruption, his skin a question mark they couldn't ignore. And all he had done was walk through the front door. The security guard approached with deliberate steps, heavy boots echoing on the marble floor as if summoned not by danger but by doubt, wearing a fine suit. Daniel stood still, spine straight, eyes steady. His wallet was still in his hand, card offered plainly across the counter. But Melissa didn't take it. She looked past him instead, relieved now that someone in uniform had arrived. "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" the guard asked, his voice low but unmistakably stern. Melissa didn't answer right away. Her fingers hovered near the keyboard, as if unsure whether to continue the check-in process or let the man in the dark blazer handle what she had already judged to be a disruption. "He says he has a reservation," she said finally, tone careful, like she was diffusing something explosive. Daniel turned his head slightly toward the guard. "I do," he said. "Daniel Carter, meeting room 4. My guest will arrive shortly. Takashi Mori. We're scheduled for 11. The guard gave no nod of recognition at the name, no sign he understood who Takashi Mori was, or who Daniel Carter might be. Instead, he narrowed his eyes slightly, as if Daniel's composure itself was a kind of provocation. "You have a membership card, sir?" "Yes," Daniel replied, offering it again. "It's right here." But now the gesture felt different, less like a formality, more like a defense, as though he were proving something basic, fundamental, something that other men in this room would never be asked to prove. Melissa leaned over the desk and typed again, confirming what she already knew but somehow needed to triple-check. The screen glowed with the same answer. Daniel Carter, reservation confirmed, room 4, 11 a.m. Still, she didn't look at him. "There's no note of a guest," she said, as if grasping for something to justify her instinct. "I didn't submit a guest list," Daniel said evenly. "We're both on the board. It's an internal discussion." The guard shifted his weight. "Without a guest note, I'm afraid, we'll need confirmation from management, and until then you'll have to wait outside the main lounge area." Daniel's jaw tightened, barely. Inside, a dull tremor was building in his chest, not fear, not quite. Not anger in its rawest form, either. It was something older, deeper, shaped by years of learning what was expected of him and years more of learning to survive anyway. He gave a tight nod. "Then call the manager." At that moment, he noticed the shift in the air. Not just Melissa, not just the guard. People around the room had begun watching. A few tried to pretend they weren't. A woman with gray-blonde curls, sitting on a velvet settee, angled her phone slightly. Subtle, but not subtle enough. Her name, he'd later find out, was Amanda Holden. She had a popular blog and a quiet obsession with truth in ugly places. Right now, she was live-streaming from her phone, barely moving her fingers as the lens caught Daniel's profile and the wall of polished resistance facing him. "Why is he being stopped?" one comment flashed on her screen. "He looks calm, what's the issue?" another read. Daniel wasn't aware of the live stream yet. He only felt the weight of the eyes, the weight of having to remain dignified in a room that silently questioned his right to dignity. A room that wouldn't say what it was thinking because it didn't need to. The glances said enough. "I'm not leaving the building," Daniel said finally. "You can call whoever you need, but I'm not stepping outside while I'm being verified like a delivery." The guard's brows rose slightly. "We're asking for cooperation, sir. That's all." "No," Daniel said, still calm, still measured. "What you're asking is that I stop being seen, that I wait, somewhere out of sight, until I'm acceptable." Melissa looked up sharply at that, lips parting as if to object, but she didn't. Because that was exactly what it was, and somehow, saying it aloud made her flinch more than doing it had. Daniel turned his gaze to her, and his voice dropped just slightly, a layer of pain beneath the steel. "Is that the policy here?" he asked, "or just for people like me?" Melissa said nothing. The guard, sensing the shift, looked toward the back hallway, perhaps hoping a supervisor would emerge and relieve him of the uncomfortable duty, but no one came. Amanda's phone kept filming, the comments piling up. Strangers watching in real time as a man in a suit with a confirmed reservation stood toe-to-toe with assumptions that would. Inside, Daniel felt the familiar throb of rage building, but he couldn't let it rise. Not here, not now. His breathing slowed. He thought of all the moments in his life where being right didn't matter, where composure was the only shield he had. He had mastered the art of being calm in the face of insult, not because it was fair, but because it was necessary. And yet, something cracked inside him, barely perceptible but real. He didn't want to play along anymore. "I am not the one making a scene," he said, not raising his voice, but letting each word carry. "I walked in, said my name, and gave you my reservation. I've done nothing but follow the process, and still, I'm being treated like an intruder." He looked around, now, fully, at the people pretending not to stare. A man in a gray suit looked away. The woman with the phone kept it steady. The silence deepened. Melissa's fingers twitched on the counter, her eyes darting from the screen to Daniel to the guard. The truth was, she couldn't explain what she was doing in any way that didn't sound like prejudice dressed in polite grammar. "And still," she said, "we're just following protocol." "No," Daniel said softly. "You're following assumption." The elevator chimed again behind them. He turned his head slightly, expecting Takashi. But it wasn't him. Just more witnesses, more eyes, more quiet judgment. And somewhere, unnoticed by everyone at the front desk, Amanda's live-stream viewer count climbed past 200. The world was watching now, but none of them knew that the most powerful man in that room was not the one being protected. It was the one being questioned. The lobby had turned into a quiet courtroom. No gavel, no judge, but judgment everywhere. Eyes lingered with increasing discomfort as Amanda Holden's live stream quietly passed 1,000 viewers. She didn't say much into the camera, just enough for context, her voice low. "This man's been standing here for 10 minutes with proof of a reservation. They're still not letting him in. I don't know what they're waiting for." Her phone lens stayed fixed on Daniel Carter's profile, capturing every tick of restraint in his jaw, every breath held behind civility. The guard stood rigid beside him, eyes darting between Daniel and the front desk, waiting for someone higher up to intervene, to justify or relieve the tension. But it was Daniel who broke the moment. Not with outrage, not with protest, but with precision. He reached slowly back into his jacket and drew out a small white card. No embellishment, just a clean, simple design. He held it up, pinched gently between two fingers, and placed it on the counter in front of Melissa without a word. She blinked once, hesitated, then leaned forward to read it. Her lips parted. It was barely larger than a business card, but to her it might as well have been a detonator. Embossed in modest gray type were the words, "Daniel Carter, Chief Executive Officer, Carter International Hospitality." Below, a private number, a corporate logo, and a line in Japanese characters she didn't understand. The air between them shifted. She straightened, as if realizing only now she had been sitting too comfortably above a man who had never been beneath her. Rachel, for the first time that morning, spoke Daniel's full name with a different tone. "Mr. Carter?" Her voice caught on something halfway between disbelief and dawning fear. Behind her eyes, gears turned at a panicked pace. Her mind was no longer on whether he belonged here, but on who had just watched her assume he didn't. The security guard took a step back, face neutral, but the retreat was telling. It was the retreat of someone suddenly unsure of which side of the line he stood on. Melissa looked down at the screen in front of her again, seeing the reservation with fresh eyes as if it had grown weight. She stumbled over her own words, her throat dry. "I didn't realize, the reservation was listed under initials. D. Carter. I thought—" Daniel's voice broke through her unraveling explanation with quiet finality. "I do that intentionally," he said. "Use initials when I book rooms here. I like to know how guests are treated when no one's watching, when they don't appear important." He didn't look angry. Not exactly, but the cold steadiness in his gaze stripped every layer of excuse from Melissa's face. He turned to the guard now, not out of aggression, but clarity. "I've been coming to this club for 4 years. I pay full corporate membership under my holding group. I've hosted meetings here with 3 senators and 2 ambassadors. Yet today, when I walked in, I was told to use the back." Amanda Holden's voice whispered again into her phone, not needing volume to carry weight. They were about to throw out the owner of the meeting room. Daniel turned toward the lobby then, speaking not just to the people behind the counter, but to the space itself. The air, the architecture of entitlement. "My guest, Mr. Takashi Mori, is arriving in 10 minutes. When he gets here, what would you like me to tell him he's walking into? Because I assure you he won't just see this as a scheduling mix-up." Melissa looked like her skin was draining of color. Her hands were shaking now, subtly but uncontrollably. She opened her mouth again, a desperate reach for something to say, anything, but Daniel raised one hand, not in anger, in finality. "Please, don't insult both of us by pretending this was a misunderstanding," he said. "You knew exactly what you assumed the moment you saw me." He turned back to the counter, picked up the card, and slid it into his wallet. The simple motion felt loaded, as if he were reclaiming not just paper but power, reminding everyone present that he hadn't lost control for a moment, and yet, deep inside, beneath the calm performance he'd mastered over a lifetime, something inside him cracked and shifted, not the old familiar hurt, not the humiliating surprise, but a colder, quieter grief. Because it didn't matter how successful he became, how many titles followed his name, he would still be asked to prove he belonged in spaces that should have welcomed him without question. Melissa finally spoke again, this time barely above a whisper. "Mr. Carter, I'm deeply sorry. I didn't intend." "It's not about your intentions," Daniel cut in, not unkindly, but with truth that offered no comfort. "It's about your instinct." Behind them, Amanda's live stream viewership ticked upward again, the screen flooding with comments. "He's handling this with more grace than I ever could. She wouldn't have treated a white man like that, CEO or not." This is exactly why representation at the top matters. Danielle stepped back from the desk. He didn't storm off. He didn't demand a scene. He simply stood still, allowing the silence to stretch and say what no one else dared to. That this moment wasn't new. It was only public. Melissa stood frozen, unsure if she should apologize again or disappear. The security guard looked toward the hallway once more, but now with the quiet understanding that whatever authority he thought he had a moment ago had evaporated. And Daniel, he did not gloat, he did not smirk, he simply waited. Because the truth had already spoken, and now the whole room had to sit with it. The room didn't breathe for a long while after Daniel stepped away from the counter. He hadn't gone far, just a few feet toward the row of velvet armchairs by the tall bay windows, the very place where, moments before, a man in a gray blazer had shifted uncomfortably to avoid sitting near him. Now, as Daniel sat with quiet grace, he felt all eyes adjust again. Not to his presence this time, but to their own discomfort in witnessing it. His name had landed like a stone in still water. Daniel Carter, C.O. Not a name whispered behind a door, but spoken aloud, confirmed, filmed, and now reverberating across more than 1,000 screens through Amanda Holden's live stream. From where she stood, Amanda lowered her phone slightly, not to stop recording, but to see him more clearly. He didn't look victorious. There was no smugness, no sense of triumph on his face. Instead, there was a silence in him that spoke louder than anything he'd said. A silence built from years of this exact moment, repeated in hotel lobbies, boardrooms, airports. The world kept asking him to stay calm while it made him prove he belonged. He watched the clock above the fireplace tick toward 11. Takashi Mori would be arriving any minute, and Daniel couldn't let this nonsense bleed into the meeting. Business required focus, and his name carried too much weight to show visible cracks. But even as he sat composed, he felt it in his chest. The pressure, not just from this incident, but from the quiet understanding that no success would ever fully shield him. The truth had always been simple. Blackness came first, credentials came later. Behind the counter, Melissa hesitated, biting her lip. She could feel it, the shift, the surveillance. The heat of her own choices catching up to her in real time. She wasn't new, she wasn't careless, but in that moment, when Daniel Carter had stepped forward in his immaculate navy suit, her instincts had spoken louder than her training, and now those instincts were on display for a growing audience. She turned to the hallway behind her, whispered something to the assistant manager who had finally appeared, then slowly stepped out from behind the counter. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor, but in her chest the sound was deafening. Each step closer to Daniel felt heavier than the last. When she reached him, she stood still, her hands trembling slightly, fingers clasped in front of her as if she were shielding herself from the very apology she had come to give. "Mr. Carter," her voice cracked, thin, barely more than air. He looked up. She looked into his eyes and saw not anger, not even disappointment, but something worse, clarity. He saw her entirely. "I wanted to speak to you," she said, "privately, if that's all right." Daniel didn't respond right away. He studied her face, the flush rising in her cheeks, the way her eyes shimmered, not just with shame, but with fear. Not the kind of fear she'd felt earlier, when she assumed she was dealing with someone who didn't belong, but the kind that comes when you realize your assumptions have consequences far beyond a single moment. He stood, slow and composed, and nodded once toward the hallway. They moved into a side room just off the lobby. Small, quiet, glass-walled. Amanda didn't follow, but her camera stayed steady, now panning to the door behind which a private reckoning was unfolding. Inside, Melissa turned to face him. Her composure broke. Her eyes were red now, and her voice was barely holding together. I didn't know, she said, breath shaky. I didn't know who you were, I swear. I wasn't trying to, I just didn't think. Daniel raised one hand, not harsh but firm. You didn't need to know who I was, he said. That's the point. Melissa looked down, ashamed. I made a mistake. A bad one. I reacted without thinking. I thought maybe you were someone who didn't belong, he finished for her, voice low. Someone who shouldn't be walking through the front door, asking for a room. She nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking into her like ice. I'm sorry. Daniel watched her for a moment. He could see it. Her apology wasn't hollow. It wasn't performative. She looked like someone who had just come face to face with a version of herself she didn't want to admit existed. But still, he'd lived long enough to know that good intentions were no shield against harm. He'd seen the difference between guilt and growth, and it lived in what came next. He spoke, calmly but with the gravity of someone speaking from the bottom of a long well. This happens more often than you think, he said, to people who don't have business cards that make everyone backtrack, people who don't have live streams to hold others accountable, people who leave through the back door when asked, and no one ever sees them again. Melissa nodded, tears now forming along the edge of her lashes. I submitted a letter of resignation. I didn't want to put the club at risk. I know what this will become. Daniel's expression didn't soften, but it shifted. There was something else now, an echo of weariness. I don't want to ruin anyone's life, he said. I don't believe in that. But I do believe in consequences. I'll understand, Melissa whispered. Whatever happens, I understand. Daniel took a breath, long and controlled. You'll receive the full severance package, and I'll include a letter confirming that. But I suggest you use this moment not to bury but to remember. Because the next man who walks in here and gets questioned won't be me. And no one will be live streaming when it happens. She nodded again, silently, face wet now, though she tried not to show it. He watched her try to hold herself together and, despite everything, felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. Perhaps not forgiveness, but the beginning of empathy. Or maybe the exhaustion of holding on to rage when clarity had already done the work. Back in the lobby, the viewer count on Amanda's stream had crept to 2,500. Comments flooded in, some angry, some praising Daniel's restraint, others sharing their own stories of being treated like strangers in places they should have belonged. The world was watching. Not for spectacle, but for something honest. Daniel stepped out of the side room and walked back to the main lounge. He adjusted his cuff, glanced at his watch. 11:01, right on time. He didn't look back. There was nothing left in that moment for him. Just a quiet, unfinished sentence in the long conversation between perception and reality. And it wasn't over. Not yet. The double glass doors of the Arlington Club eased open just as Daniel returned to his seat. A gust of cold air followed a man in a charcoal gray overcoat, trim and distinguished, his movements crisp and deliberate. Takashi Mori stepped into the lobby with the quiet authority of someone who never needed to announce his presence. His eyes scanned the space, curious but calm, until they found Daniel standing near the fireplace. Daniel gave a small nod, and Takashi responded with a slight bow before walking over. Daniel-san, he greeted, removing his gloves. I hope I'm not late. Right on time, Daniel replied, gesturing toward the meeting room down the corridor. Shall we? Takashi paused for half a second, glancing toward the front desk, where the remnants of tension still lingered like the scent of something scorched. Melissa was gone. Her manager had stepped in, stiff-backed and silent. The security guard had retreated somewhere out of sight, but the lobby hadn't forgotten. Neither had Amanda Holden, still seated with her phone lowered now, eyes studying every movement with a mixture of reflection and quiet vindication. As they walked toward the meeting room, Takashi spoke low. Something happened here, didn't it? Daniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, but it didn't reach his eyes. Let's just say we've already had our first negotiation of the day. Inside the private boardroom, the atmosphere changed. walnut-paneled walls, etched glass, and a polished table prepared for two. A carafe of coffee steamed quietly between them. Daniel took his seat with practiced ease, but inside, the weight of the morning still clung to him. He didn't let it show, not now. Takashi unpacked a folder and slid it across the table. I reviewed the terms. I think we are aligned. Our teams will want some adjustments on the international licensing, but the equity split looks fair. Daniel skimmed the document. His mind worked quickly, efficiently. This part was familiar. Safe. It didn't care what he looked like. Contracts responded only to clarity, to value. And Daniel had spent decades mastering both. I've been thinking, he said, eyes still on the page. There's a proposal I'd like to add, not as a clause, but as a commitment. Takashi looked up, curious. Go on. I want to establish a scholarship fund, Daniel said. Jointly sponsored by Carter International and Mori Global, for students of color pursuing careers in hospitality leadership. Not just hotel workers, future general managers, CEOs, innovators. Takashi's brow lifted slightly, then his expression softened. That's a bold idea. I'm tired of watching promising people get passed over, doubted, asked to prove they belong in rooms they've earned 10 times over, Daniel said, his voice low but steady. This morning was just another reminder. It can't always be about reacting after harm is done. Sometimes we have to plant the change ahead of the wound. Takashi nodded slowly. A seed in the right place, he murmured. It grows stronger than the walls built to keep it out. Daniel looked at him, genuinely moved. Exactly. They shook hands, not as businessmen, but as men who understood the value of legacy. And in that moment, the pain of the morning began to bend, just slightly, into something that resembled purpose. When they stepped out of the meeting room 40 minutes later, the lobby was quieter. Amanda was gone. The crowd had dispersed, but the residue of what had happened still lingered in the air like dust after a storm. As Takashi headed toward the door, Daniel paused, turning back for one last glance at the place where it all began. The front desk, the cold tile floor, the echo of assumption. He took a breath, not one of relief, but of recognition. This was how it would always be. One confrontation at a time, one moment where someone chose dignity instead of rage, one person who would remember, one person who would change. And sometimes, that was enough. He stepped toward the glass doors, the light of the street outside glowing gold against the late morning frost. The world hadn't changed. Not really. But a seed had been planted. In that room, in that staff, in that live stream, still circling online. And as he walked out into the cold, Daniel Carter didn't feel victorious. He felt grounded. Not because justice had been served, but because he had stayed exactly who he was in the face of a system that asked him not to be. He exhaled slowly, not from exhaustion, but from clarity, because change doesn't come wrapped in applause. It begins often on the worst kind of morning, in the most familiar kind of pain, and still it begins.